Senator Gianaris.
Mr. President, would the sponsor or a designated senator answer a few questions?
Senator Nozzolio.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Skelos and Senator Klein are the prime sponsors of this legislation, but I'll be addressing any questions of Senator Gianaris or members of this House.
Thank you,
Senator Gianaris.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the sponsor explain to us why it is in this resolution that there are different vote totals required to pass a piece of legislation out of this chamber depending on which party is in control of the chamber?
Mr. President, my colleagues, for everyone's edification, the measure before us is a constitutional amendment that requires passage of two consecutively elected legislatures. The legislature elected in 2011-2012 engaged in first passage. This now is before this House for second passage. It has already passed the New York State Assembly, and in order for it to be on the ballot for consideration by the public this year, it needs to be enacted before the end of this month. The portion of the measure that Senator Gianaris is referring to requires a standard for the execution of the process, a standard that changes when one party controls the Senate, the Assembly, and the governor's office. The intention of the drafters was to ensure, Mr. President and my colleagues, that there wouldn't be rode roughshod over the interests of the minority party, whatever that minority party may be. And in order to protect the sentiments of the minority party, that this standard would be risen if there was complete control by one party of both branches of the legislature and the governor.
Would Senator Nozzolio continue to yield?
Senator
Mr. President, I'd be happy to yield.
Senator yields.
The answer just given is a noble goal, but my question is, why is that protection for the minority party only provided in one circumstance, when one party is in the minority as opposed to the other? Why are not both parties afforded that protection? Oh, I'm just getting started.
Mr. President, in response to the Senator's question, is that there are conferences established and that the leadership of those conferences is delegated and delineated in both the Assembly and the Senate by having a majority leader and minority leader. That's the delineation made in this legislation.
Would Mr. Nozzolio continue to yield, Mr. President?
Senator, do you continue to yield?
Yes,
Senator yields.
I understand that each House has a majority leader and minority leader, but my question is, why is a different vote total required to pass a redistricting bill when a particular party is in the minority? Why is it not a blanket two-thirds vote, which is what this provides in a certain circumstance? Why is not a two-thirds vote required to pass a redistricting bill, period, end of story, regardless as to which party is in the majority or minority? Because this legislation says if a particular party, and practically speaking it's the Republican Party, is in the majority, a simple majority vote is needed. If the Democrats are in the majority, a two-thirds vote is needed.
The question is a very fair one. I think the answer is that this is a logical extension of what is established here, and when one party controls, the protections of the minority, in effect, can be run over roughshod by a vote, and that this vote is to set a different standard. For instance, in the Assembly, now where the Republicans have, I believe, less than a third of the chamber as representatives, this measure would require the standard to be set higher for the passage, enactment, final enactment, and I really should say enactment slash acceptance of the Commission's report, that this measure delegates to a commission the responsibility to draft legislation that would create congressional, state Senate, and state Assembly districts. this legislation under the constitutional amendment could not be amended by the legislature. There would be no opportunity by the legislature whatsoever to amend. It would be either an up vote or a down vote, a yes or a no. And to have a minority, in effect, protection by having, when one party does control all branches, that this does have a check and a balance, an attempt at establishing that check and balance in this process.
Would Senator Nozzolio continue to yield, Mr.
Senator
President?
Nozzolio, do you yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator yields.
Thank you. I heard that last answer, and I guess my question to Senator Nozzolio is, does he believe that because we had a divided legislature last year, with Democrats in control of the Assembly and Republicans in control of the Senate, that the interests of the minority party in the Senate at the time were not run roughshod by the redistricting process?
Mr. President, I believe that this measure is a measure to establish an independent redistricting process and establish that independence as much as possible within the frameworks of the Constitution and the authority granted to the Commission and the responsibility of the legislature to accept or reject the Commission's report. We say when the delegation establishes a one-party rule, Governor, Assembly, Senate, the chances of there being unanimity is also an opportunity for that one party to destroy whatever fairness there is in the process. Senator Gianaris references last year. If I recall, Mr. President, there was a governor who was a Democrat. There was a New York State Assembly that had Democrat control, and there was a majority of Republicans in the New York State Senate. That created a balance that was, I believe, not shown in the prior 2 years before that, when the Senate was controlled by the Democrats, the Assembly was controlled by the Democrats, and the governor was controlled by the Democrats. This effort, this constitutional amendment, is an effort to provide a balance, a check, and a counterweight when there is a one-party domination of state government.
Yield?
Senator Nozzolio, do you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator yields.
Did Senator Nozzolio believe that Democratic control of the Assembly in any way inhibited the Republican majority's desire and ability to do whatever it wanted with the Senate lines last year?
Mr. President, I'm not schooled in being a guest on talk shows, being a pundit, being a speculator, being a Democratic or Republican analyst. That question requires a political analysis that I am not qualified to make.
To continue to yield?
Senator, do you yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator yields.
Senator Nozzolio may not be skilled in any of those things, but he is skilled at gerrymandering, and he proved that last year very effectively. Oh, please. My question to Senator Nozzolio is...
Sorry, I had trouble hearing Senator Gianaris. Did he say that this was an action that he may have or may have not have heard when he walked out of the chamber last year when this measure was debated before this legislature? Is that what Senator Gianaris said? I couldn't hear.
Senator Nozzolio, are you at?
Mr. President, that is not what I was insinuating. In fact, I voted against the lines. I walked out on this abomination of a constitutional amendment that we're voting on for the second time today. But let me continue if Senator Nozzolio would continue to yield.
Mr. President, I've continued to lead to a serious debate and serious questions. It appears on the edge of seriousness by the proponent of these questions at this point. Let's see what the question is before I decide to yield further.
Senator Gianaris.
Thank you, Mr. President. The resolution before us outlines different scenarios depending on the political affiliation of the Speaker of the Assembly and the temporary President of the Senate. My question to Senator Nozzolio is, how is the political affiliation of the temporary president of the Senate determined? Is it with which conference they choose to sit, by which lines they choose to run on in November, or some other factor?
Barely knew the answer this year. I certainly can't speculate. The laws are there, the structure is there. The year that this would be in effect is 2020. And that's the formulas here. The answer can only be answered in 2020.
Senator Gianaris.
Would Senator Nozzolio continue to yield?
Senator Nozzolio, do you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator yields.
If in 2020 we are faced with a structural situation in the Senate exactly identical to that which we have today, how would the political affiliation of the temporary president of the Senate be determined? It's not a crazy hypothetical. We're living under it today.
Mr. President, that is a question of law that would be answered by the attorneys and the courts at that time.
Senator, do you continue
Yes,
to
Mr.
yield?
President.
Senator yields.
Is Senator Nozzolio's suggestion that we would undoubtedly end up in a confusing and lengthy court proceeding if we are facing the same situation in 2020 than we face today?
Mr. President, I think it's similar to the situation that Senator Gianaris mentioned when there was a question of who would be the next lieutenant governor. That he was a big proponent, if I recall. That was a question that was ultimately decided by the New York State Court of Appeals. And that certainly is a question, I think, similar in nature to this one.
The Senator continue to yield.
Senator, do you continue to yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator yields.
Would Senator Nozzolio answer if we had a situation similar to today, where the temporary president position alternates, literally on a day-to-day basis, would the vote required on the floor of this chamber depend on what day we were taking the vote?
Mr. President, I stand by my previous answer. Again, it's part of the structure of this House and the determinations as to how, and for that matter, the structure of the Assembly. These hypotheticals could occur in either House at either time. That I believe we can only gauge what the law is today and what the structure is under current rule and current legislative law that establishes the organization of the Senate and the Assembly.
Senator Gianaris.
Would the Senator continue to yield?
Senator, do you yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
The Senator yields.
I suspect I may get the same answer, but I just want to ask the question for the record. Also in this resolution is a provision that the commission, Redistricting Commission itself, will require different votes depending on the party affiliation of the temporary president. And I guess my question is, would the commission itself require a different vote total depending on which day they take the vote if we have an alternating president scenario?
Mr. President, again, it's a speculative question that only can be answered at the very least 8 years from now. And that it's something that certainly the legislature at that time will have to deal with. But the essence, and I think we're losing the essence on this track, the essence of this legislation is to have the legislature empower a commission that would produce a product that could not be amended by the legislature, regardless of who the temporary president was, a product that, in effect, would have to be voted on in a procedure that would hopefully protect, as a check and balance, the rights of the minority party in this legislature.
Would the Senator continue to yield, Mr. President?
Senator Nozzolio, do you yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator continues to yield.
Could Senator Nozzolio explain to us whether he considers the commission that would be established by this resolution independent?
Mr. President, this commission established within the boundaries that the legislature has under the New York State Constitution, Article 3, Section 1. The delegation that describes the legislative powers and authorities of this body and the New York State Assembly, that this grant of authority is to a commission to produce a product that could not be amended by the legislature, a product that would have a higher standard of support necessary if one party was in complete control of the legislative process and the governor's office, and that this measure provides the opportunity for a commission to do its work, requires the work to be done under this provision, under full compliance with the Voting Rights Act and all other provisions of law governing redistricting. It requires a product to be produced, a series of hearings to be conducted. It requires the public to have significant input into the process, and it does not allow the legislature, and I need to emphasize this, the constitutional amendment forbids the legislature from amending this product that's ultimately produced by the commission.
Senator, continue to yield.
Senator Nozzolio, do you yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator yields.
I heard Senator Nozzolio twice indicate that the legislature cannot amend the product. Isn't it in fact the case that if the legislature rejects the product of the commission once, it can amend the subsequent product as often as it likes?
Thank you for raising that, Senator. Yes, I said it could not amend. I meant on the first two passages. On the third enactment, there could be amendments in this, under this provision. But again, it would be the third time, not the first time, not the second time, but the third time, in order to get ultimately a product produced.
Continue to yield, Mr. President.
Senator Nozzolio,
Yes, Mr.
continue to
President.
yield. Senator yields.
So just to clarify then, would Senator Nozzolio agree that the legislature in fact has the final say, and there is a process through this amendment, if enacted, where the legislature can simply follow the exact process that was followed last year and ignore the recommendations of the commission?
President, I'd like to point out to my good friend and my colleagues that this measure is much akin to the Judicial Selection Commission that was delegated authority by legislatures in the past, basically telling the governor of this state that your selections as appointees to positions in the judiciary should be screened and developed and pro-offered to the governor by the commission, where the governor would have the opportunity to say yes or no in nominating those individuals to a particular judgeship appointment. This is very similar in that the legislature, under this constitutional provision, provides an opportunity, creates a commission, says to the commission, you develop the product, here are the guidelines. At the end of the day, we need to endorse that commission proposal. If there cannot be agreement, if the governor vetoes the provision twice, that third time the legislature would be acting, but not until that time.
Would the senator continue to yield?
Senator Nozzolio.
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator yields.
I want to give Senator Nozzolio an opportunity to, I think he misspoke. My reading of the resolution indicates that upon the legislature has the ability to amend the second plan presented, that it does not have to go through a third round before the legislature can present its amendments. I believe that's page 3 of the resolution.
If that's a question, Mr. President, would you ask Senator Gianaris to again reference the provision he's discussing?
I'd be happy to, Mr. President. It's on page 3, lines 11 through 17, indicates that if either house shall fail to approve the second plan, each house shall introduce such legislation with any amendments it deems necessary. It's the second plan that could be amended. It doesn't have to go to a third plan.
under this provision, that Plan 1 would be, have been provided by the Redistricting Commission and failed. Plan 2 would have had to come before the Redistricting Commission, and it would have to fail as well. That this would provide an opportunity for that plan to be amended, but it really would be the third time that a plan would be before the body for consideration.
Senator, continue to yield.
Senator Nozzolio.
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator yields.
With respect, I just want to clarify this point because I think it's an important one. As I read the language of the resolution, it's my understanding that the legislature would have to take, if the legislature was intent on passing its own plan and not what the commission recommended, it would have to vote against one plan, the first plan. On the second plan, it merely says if the House fails to approve it, which means we could take no action whatsoever, which would constitute a failure to approve the legislation, and then amend it and pass whatever the legislature wished.
Mr. President, that the intent of this resolution is to have the legislature act and vote on such a plan.
Would the Senator continue to yield, Mr. President?
Senator Nozzolio. Senator yields.
How would the process set up by this resolution in any way differ from the process we witnessed last year, with one exception, and that is that this commission will produce a plan that can be completely ignored by the legislature? Aren't we in fact dealing with the establishment of an advisory commission that simply leaves the power in the legislature to do whatever it chooses at the end of that process?
I believe that this measure is establishing an independent process, a process that is requiring individuals to put together a product that must be voted on by the legislature. And those votes are consequences that I believe the questioner, in making the question, is discounting. That there will be an enormous amount of citizen input, an enormous amount of effort, an enormous amount of process that the public will have an opportunity to engage in. For the legislature then to, as well as the governor, to ignore that process in any way, I believe certainly would be contrary to the public interest. The divisible grant of authority, though, that I think the next question that Senator Gianaris may be contemplating is one that he raised in committee, a question about, well, why not simply make it so that the legislature would never have an opportunity to vote on the process? A question that is not illogical, but it is also not within the constitutional framework of our state constitution as it's currently presented, and it would further erode any type of legislative authority to simply pick and choose what individual grants of authority the legislature will make. It is Article 3, Section 1, which I'll repeat, grants an indivisible grant of authority by the people of this state to the legislature. Having that grant of authority obliterated obliterates Article 3, Section 1, and a pick-and-choose type approach for the ultimate decision being the people of this state through their legislature would be contrary. In other words, the people of this state, speaking through their legislatures, will ultimately decide this ultimate law, this ultimate plan, as well as others. And that for the legislature to can't pick and choose its opportunity to grant articles of authority or divisions of authority on an issue-by-issue basis.
Would the senator continue to yield, Mr.
Senator Nozzolio?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator yields.
Is the senator aware that we are discussing amending the Constitution, and therefore we are not bound by any current provisions of the Constitution by what we're proposing? So in other words, the fact that the current Constitution gives the legislature the final say does not mean that we cannot propose removing that authority from the legislature in a constitutional amendment.
Mr. President, I think that takes a very narrow, tunneled view of what a constitutional amendment does. Under Senator Gianaris' logic, then you could change the state constitution or any constitution, our national constitution, in one way with total disregard for the other provisions of that constitution. I don't think that's something that the original drafters of either the state or federal constitution would support, that certainly the courts would not want an individual grant of some sort to be contrary to another constitutional provision. That would be certainly ripe for challenge. It would be an issue that would be fought in the courts for years, and it's something that I think certainly would not result in the type of process that this bill contemplates.
Senator Nozzolio?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator yields.
Is the senator aware that March of 2011, he and all of his colleagues on that side of the aisle voted for a constitutional amendment that would in fact strip the legislature of complete authority over redistricting? And I wonder why his opinion has changed on that issue.
Measure that Senator Gianaris is referring to. But whatever it was, that will no more stand the constitutional test than the other legislation that Senator Gianaris is referring to. I think that the point, Senator, is this, that regardless of what votes were taken by any members of this legislature on any other issue, the issue before us is one that we're dealing with now. The issue before us is the one you and I are addressing. And the measure before us, I believe, is irrelevant to that discussion of other legislation. I should parenthetically ask, did that legislation pass both houses? And is it before us for discussion today? I think the answer to that, Mr. President, would be no.
Would the senator continue to yield, Mr. President?
Senator Gianaris. Excuse me, Senator Nozzolio, do you continue to yield?
Be glad to, Senator.
Senator continues to yield.
For the senators and everyone's edification, it was a Senator Bonisic bill, S3331, in the last session that was voted upon. But no, it did not pass the Assembly. It is not before us today. I was merely asking because your explanation of the current resolution before us would seem to indicate that you would oppose an effort like that you apparently voted for. But let's move on from that. I want to go back for a moment to the question of the supermajority vote requirement in certain circumstances. I heard Senator Nozzolio say that it is the will of the voters through their representatives that will determine whether these plans get enacted or whether this amendment is adopted ultimately. But my question is, why does this resolution not trust the will of the voters in determining the composition of the two houses so that the same vote requirements would apply under any circumstances? I was perhaps not as articulate as I could have been. Let me try and rephrase that. Why are the supporters of this resolution concerned that the will of the voters might enable the same party to control both houses and through their will enact a plan like every other bill we pass that requires the same vote total regardless of which party's in charge?
President, I think the will of the voters certainly will be heard by the enactment of this constitutional amendment. That's the ultimate will of the voters. The my friend, distinguished minority leader, talks about a hypothetical and somehow suggests that we have the will of the people of the state collectively voiced through the actions of the legislature. The point is this, that the citizens of the state will have the opportunity to decide whether this is a provision that makes sense, that will be balanced, will provide a check and balance. And I think that the hypothetical raised by Senator Gianaris is just too convoluted to matter to individuals, citizens, in the sense that they'll have their ultimate say in voting for this amendment or not. And that will speak louder than any action by this legislative body.
Continue to yield, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President.
I'll begin by noting for the record that the quote-unquote convoluted hypothetical I referenced is the world in which we're living in today. So I appreciate that you're calling it convoluted. I agree. But let me ask whether you are familiar with, at any point in New York State's history, that our Constitution required different vote totals depending on which party had control of this body. Has that ever happened before?
I'm not familiar with any constitutional provision, although certainly I am with a measure that this body enacted fewer than 2 years ago, establishing the new code of ethics for the state of New York and the legislatures and legislative members.
Senator, continue to yield, Mr. President.
Senator Nozzolio.
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator yields.
Of course, the difference in those two is one is a statute that can be changed more easily than a constitutional amendment. But I guess I'll ask the question more broadly. Is the senator aware of any example in the history of the United States of America where the Constitution of any state or the charter of any locality ever required different vote totals depending on party advantage in a legislative body? Ever.
Mr. President, I certainly don't have the answer for Senator Gianaris, but I take his question very seriously, and I'll go home and do my homework this evening. It'll probably take me all night to check every state legislative constitution, as well as we might as well not limit it just to the United States. We could do all the countries of the world, and I certainly will look forward to reporting to Senator Gianaris if I have been able to find any such provision.
Mr. President, on the bill.
Senator Gianaris on the concurrent resolution.
Thank you. Let me thank Senator Nozzolio for answering my questions and yielding. The reason Senator Nozzolio was unable to answer that last question is because this is unprecedented. The idea that we would enshrine in the Constitution of our state that a particular party needs more votes than another particular party to pass legislation is outrageous in the extreme. We embarked on this effort to establish an independent process. Many of us did, some in the galleries with us today, with the idea that we would be doing something good, not that we would make things worse. And in fact, we're being presented with a resolution today that would take an extremely bad process and make it horrendous. The legislature would continue to have the final say. Not a darn thing different would have to happen other than we would have to reject this commission's proposal one time and then go right back to what happened last year. Worse, we might require extra votes if the Democrats are in charge of the Senate than if Republicans are in charge. Let me repeat that. We are attempting to put into the Constitution a process by which if one party wins an election, they require fewer votes than if another party wins the election. In our state's governing document, we do something like this, we are defaming the state constitution today. The legislature would continue to have the final say, which is the one criteria that all of us said we supported. and the entire Republican majority voted for just such a proposal by Senator Bonasek, we would be establishing a commission that would mirror the setup at the Board of Elections, which is traditionally mired in gridlock because it has an equal number of appointees by both parties, even to the point of having co-directors, one from each party. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what would happen. The reality is either the majorities would continue to control and the legislature would pass a plan just like it wanted to. This commission would be deadlocked 5-5, and nothing would come out of it, once again kicking it back to the legislature to continue the process we've had in place for decades. There would be no addressing of the issue of reducing the population deviation. Questions about whether the change to prisoner population allocation would still be in effect. And a situation where if we have a structure of the Senate like we have today, where no one is able to answer what would happen. If this was in effect right now, and this was a redistricting year, no one can tell us how this would even go. Would it depend on the day which party had the temporary presidency? Would the independent commission have to wait for the right moment to call a vote, depending on which side was in charge, to make sure they only needed a simple majority instead of a 2/3 majority? What if they were in a late-night meeting, and at the stroke of midnight there's a new temporary president? Does all of a sudden the votes have to change again? And I don't mean to make light of the current situation in this body. It exists for a number of reasons that are not relevant to this resolution. I'm merely pointing out the lunacy of requiring different vote totals depending on party advantage. And yet here we are. So-called reformers talking about how this is a good thing, others holding the line. And all of us having to make a decision whether we want to take one of the most maligned redistricting processes in the country and actually take a vote to make it worse. Because that's what we're doing today. I encourage all my colleagues to vote no on this. If it passes, I encourage the people of this state to reject it in November and give us another crack to do this right. Thank you, Mr. President.